Hello, Agnes.
Robin,
What should we talk about?
we've already decided what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, but the
George
listeners don't know.
Orwell, The Road to Wigan Pier. Okay. So what question would you like to raise about this text? Or do you want to maybe describe it for our listeners? Because they probably maybe many of them won't have read it.
Right. So George Orwell, famous author of 1984 and Animal Farm. Um, this is earlier in his life, a bit earlier. This is 1937 when this book comes out. And he sees himself as a socialist, and he was paid by a socialist leaning organization to go do this trip to a industrial town to live there and experience it and write about their lives as a way to induce sympathy for these people.
Multiple towns. I think he goes to
Okay.
in the north
Right.
of England.
Right. 20
Mining towns and then places where there's a lot of people out of work.
Right. And he does, and he writes that up, and it has the kind of effect that is intended. But then on reflection, he adds a whole other section of his book where he thinks about this whole process of what it is that makes people like or not like socialists and want to join them or not. He basically thinks it's just really obvious if you think about it. The socialism is great, although he doesn't clarify what exactly it is. But he has some interesting arguments about what are some of the obstacles that put people off about socialism. And
Uh,
I I say there's three of them. But I see this as a nice example of, say, politics isn't about policy. If you hear the book is about socialism, you might think he discusses anything at all about the trade-offs of socialist policy, but he has no interest in that whatsoever. But what he does think about is how people feel about socialism in terms of being willing to identify it or associate it with it or not. And he's insightful in that. And he presents some of his own internal conflicts, especially about these issues, because he has different high level thoughts about what he should feel than what he decides he does feel.
So maybe it's worth distinguishing conceptually socialism from the prince class abolition. Because a lot of this text is about trying to abolish the snobbery that the higher class people feel in relation to the lower class people, including abolishing that in oneself and the very, very deep roots of that inside of a person whose whole sensibility and tastes have been developed in a high class way, and then correlatively abolishing the disdain that the lower class people feel for the high class people and the thought that such people can never be included into their world. Um, and so, yeah, one idea is socialism, but a sort of more specific idea is something like communion across class lines and the social and cultural difficulties that
Right.
presents when someone concretely tries to do it, as Orwell does. And what he says at a certain point is that he first tried to commune with like tramps and vagrants and drunkards and that class of people, and he said that was easy. It was even with his fancy accent. If he wore dirty clothes and he went to the places where they were very welcoming, and they were they were enough of outsiders that he could be one of them almost immediately. Whereas to get inside of a lower class household, to be welcomed into a home, and then even if you were in the home, to feel like you were of them, he saw was very difficult.
Right. So, like I said, there were these three different lines of things that were obstacles to socialism. And you're focusing on one of them, which I do think is the most interesting one. And it's probably the one that got the most attention for this book. Uh, that is, he sees one key correlated idea with socialism is this idea that there's a class war and you're supposed to side with the lower class. So he feels like he should. And he gives this example of he worked in Burma as a police officer. And there he felt it was really obvious that the locals were right and that the foreigners were wrong to be there controlling the locals. And in that conflict, he wanted very much to side with the Burmese. And that's partly why he left Burma and no longer in those roles. And then by analogy, he thought that he should be siding with the lower classes in his country because they were like the Burmese, but he couldn't very well. That is, he had grown up in a culture and he had assimilated many cultural values, and he saw that the lower classes had different cultural values. And when he looked at their lives, he saw some of those differences were to blame for their worse situation in their lives there in the north of England. Um, but he thought he was supposed to support the lower classes over his upper class origins, even though he says he's not very rich. He does agree and sees that he has those values. And in the end of the book, he basically says, let's do everything in socialism but eliminate classes first, because maybe that'll happen by itself, but let's not try. And in the end, he basically thinks your class is so deeply immersed in you that you shouldn't even try, because you would just not be the same person anymore if you were to try to eliminate your culture. And so this is really about cultural conflict, really,
Yeah. So
and multiculturalism, really, in a sense.
right. So, like, there's a line in here where he says, "Is it ever possible to be really intimate with the working class?" Presumably, if you're upper class like me, he doesn't even have to say that, right? He's
Right. Yeah.
no working class person is reading this, so
Right.
that's the question he asks himself. No, is his answer. It's not possible, right? He's like, I tried it. I mean, I went and I hung out with them, and I cannot do it. And what's striking is that it's harder for him than with the Burmese. That is because in his view, the Burmese don't smell, and their skin is kind of nice. So he has his the big
Right.
obstacle for him is like smell, where and it's kind of visceral. These visceral responses that have been inculcated in him to these people are dirty and they smell. And he does a lot to try to contextualize the dirt, right? He spends so long on the miners and their dirt on their bodies, the coal dust, and how no, they really would take baths if we made it possible for them to take baths. And it's wrong for us to think that they're just the sorts of people who would only use their bathtubs to hold coal, even if you gave them a bathtub or something. So you hear him working against himself, where he's like, they're people who want to be clean, but they're not clean. Like from his point of view, they're not clean, and
Right.
I was raised to have visceral reactions to certain kinds of smells or appearances of dirt or,
Wait.
he says to this day, I'm just repulsed at the thought of drinking after such a person, like drinking water as such a person, unless it's a woman. I think you stop. But yeah, I can drink after any woman. They're all clean somehow. But
Right.
right, but even to this day, after he has really worked
Right.
this snobbishness out of himself, he still can't drink water after them, after these dirty people.
So he's insightful when he talks about how other people, when they're poor but of upper class origin, they are all the more threatened by the possibility that people might confuse them with the lower classes. And they really then lean into all their cultural customs as a way to say, no, I'm really upper class.
Right, and they're spending a lot of money. They're impoverishing themselves, creating the symbols. He's in a way the lower class people who are just below them are better off because they can spend their money on food.
Right.
But these people have to spend their money on keeping up appearances to show
Right.
find the
So,
show that they're in the high.
so the Burmese race means he's never going to be confused with them. So he doesn't have to work to distinguish himself from him. But and then of course he's more likely to be confused with a lower class man than a woman. So that's also why he's more, offended by men than women. So you can see his theories work fine. That is, yes, people like him are exactly very antagonistic toward, lower class people who they could be confused with plausibly, that they're eager to distinguish themselves from. And that's the origin of his hostility for them. But he still feels it and isn't willing to let go of it. And I mean, to
You
me,
said earlier where, these people are somewhat to be blamed for their condition. I mean, I guess I thought he largely wasn't saying that. That is,
but he points out in some cases it's true. I mean,
okay, but like largely what he wants to say is there are people who want to work. And when they're given opportunities, they work really, really hard and they want to be clean, but they're not given opportunities to do so. Um,
for example, he talks about how they don't use the most nutrition cost effectiveness food. They spend extra money on more tasty food. And he says if they were in fact on average more cost effective with their food, they just get lower doles. So there's not, and and he'd rather pay for lawyers to help them get more dole. Like there's this thing where, they're tempted to get the dole and also work. And then there's, legal people who come to try to check for that. And he wants to like hide them from that because he wants them to get the dole and to be able to work.
right. So the food is an interest. So there are these interesting sort of places where they have a culture, like they have a working class culture, and that culture is going to dictate how they behave. just the same as for upper class people, which means they're not always gonna be maximally efficient, right? That's
Right.
what it is to have a culture. Like, so one of the examples is that they have to have tea all the time, and they're wasting all their money on tea, the opiate, as Orwell calls it. But another little aside that I thought was super interesting was that he thinks that they could um, a lot of the housing problems could be solved if they had, like, apartments, but these people think that it's not like, we should have houses, yeah. In air is not yours, right?
Right.
Something that's tiny, but it's on the ground, that's more your house than like, a house you can't have a slice of the sky or something, and then that Orwell's like, basically implicit like, that's silly, right? But that's what culture is thoughts like, "It matters to me that my house touches the ground." Um, and so like there are many moments where he is in a way pushing for the abolition of low class culture with his
Did.
arguments and observations. Um, and it's not clear that socialism can be anything but that, but the abolition
I mean,
of class culture.
he points out that many socialists in history have been basically, we need to fix low class culture and take away its problem.
Up, right?
Yes, exactly.
Um,
And he,
which is
but he doesn't want to do that because he feels he should take their side in a class conflict.
right. So this question: can the upper class person really and sincerely take the side of the lower class person in a class conflict? Uh, and Orwell's, like, doing his best to try to do that, but I feel like you see at so many points Orwell's sort of snobbishness come like the stuff about the food, the tinned food. I mean, he's just
Right.
revolted by the fact that these people eat tinned food.
Indeed. They couldn't have any flavor at all in that tin food, right?
Right,
We've lost all
exactly, the
flavor.
flavor, the apple versus the what other kind
The American apple has no flavor. The English apple.
exactly, right? So you see Orwell who has really he really thinks of himself as like someone who's done the work, done some self-examination. Like the modern equivalent of the this woke like the Robin DiAngelo, that kind of thing
Right.
of like you need to work on yourself. Like he's done that to an extraordinary degree. And yet he's still left with these kind of like these people are tasteless. They're eating this bad food that's like that would be below me to eat. And that
Right.
dice
But so he often
makes us want to read Orwell is that he makes observations like that he has style and
he
penetration.
is sightful and he sees things. But um, like I come to this. I had this background as an economist, hearing the word socialism and many arguments about it, and then the kinds of concepts of socialism I've heard about don't really show up much in this book.
Yeah.
Right. And then he tends to like not even want to explain social. He thinks it's obvious. He often says it's just liberty and justice. That's all it is. And even has a point where he says, if we just wanted to fix the problems, we just could. It would be obvious and it doesn't really matter how.
I was on that line because I found it extraordinary. Where it was something like, if we, it's clear to everyone that if we really wanted equality, we would just have it. Um, and I mean, I'm now not finding it. This is a 200-page document, so I'm not always able to find the quote.
Right.
But but yeah, that's you're right. So he thinks certain things are obvious, but also his conception of socialism is very idiosyncratic. I call it machine socialism. That is very and the very idea of socialism is deeply connected with the idea of machines in a way that I haven't really heard this from anyone else. So can I read? I want to read the passage where he just describes the this is not the machine part. This is just to describe what socialism is. Um uh Let me just
Page 135. I have it.
oh, okay, you read it then.
Okay. I had at that time no interest in socialism or any other economic theory. It seemed to me then, it sometimes just seems to me now, for that matter, that economic injustice will stop the moment we want to stop it, and no sooner. And if we generally want to stop it, the method adopted hardly matters.
Okay, this is not the passage I was thinking of. That's the passage I was just referring to. But let me read you the passage where he explains what socialism is. This is page 154. And all the while, everyone who uses his brain knows that socialism, as a world system and wholeheartedly applied, is a way out. It would at least ensure our getting enough to eat, even if it deprives us of anything else. Indeed, from one point of view, socialism is such elementary common sense that I am sometimes amazed that it has not established itself already. The world, here's the important part, is a raft sailing through space with potentially plenty of provisions for everybody. The idea that we must all cooperate and see to it that everyone does his fair share of the work and gets his fair share of the provisions seems so blatantly obvious that one would say that no one could possibly fail to accept it unless he had some corrupt motive for clinging to the present system. So, for Orwell, socialism is like a tautology, and it's the tautology that we're all in this together. Um, in this means in a thing that has plenty of good stuff for everyone, as long as people are willing to do the work, and then we'll get the rewards. And like that's it. It's simple. That's his understanding
Right.
of what socialism is.
Right. So as an economist, of course, I'm offended by him ignoring all the complexity. But the thing that most strikes me here is his agony that he needs to take the culture side of the lower class is not implied by this. This is completely consistent with believing that his class is right about many cultural and value things.
That's why in the beginning, when you were like, "Oh, he puts forward 3 obstacles to socialism," I wanted to say, "No, there's another consideration in this piece, which is about eliminating class, and it just doesn't it's not directly having to do with socialism. It's another." And in fact, the point of the piece is that we could separate class elimination from achievement of socialism, right? And Orwell's like, "Look, it's kind one way to read this, he would not like this at all, but I'm like, "Look, we can still be snobs and have socialism." That's what I really want. That's what I care about, is that I get to hold on to my elitism and be a
What
socialist.
I mean, but he's not willing to say it that way,
No,
but
he's not.
that's what he's implying,
Yeah.
basically. But many other people have been willing to embrace that. He's just not. And he's in conflict about it.
No. Um, right. So, but I like this description. I think it's worth spending a minute on it. This idea we're all in this together. We all need to do the work. And we'll all get the rewards. And like many of us have been in environments, right, where this logic applies. So right now I'm teaching an intensive summer class. I have a co-teacher and then I have 2 other teachers I'm working with. There's just a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and we divide it amongst ourselves, and we're constantly kind of, talking to each other who has to do what. Um and we try to be fair in dividing up the labor and dividing up the spoils, right? And that is what it is to have like a group that works together, right? I think a family is such a group. In a family, husband and wife, they'll be like, okay, you take out the trash, I will do the dishes. So we have this idea that for a group to work together well is just to divide up the labor in a fair way, and then everybody gets taken care of. That is pretty intuitive. And then the question is, why can't we just apply that to the totality of all human beings?
Well, this concept of fairness can't take the weight. That is,
Why
fairness.
can't it take it inside the family or me and my colleagues, but suddenly now it can't take it in.
Well, it's the single word that encompasses a lot of different context dependent norms. That is, we have collected many norms that help us coordinate activity in particular areas,
Mm.
and we can describe those norms as fairness. But there isn't a single uber norm underneath them, such that it would just imply fairness in every possible context.
Mhm.
Fairness is the name we give to all these other sorts of rules about how to share low work effort, how to share outcomes. Um, and there are contexts in which they're pretty complicated. So, for example, fairness in forager groups sharing food, they had complicated rules where the person who, say, brought in the animal got to break it up and give the choicest piece of meat to the people they preferred. Everybody got some meat, but there were a lot of complicated rules, even in a forager context sharing food, which kind of food was shared with who, how, and they were context dependent norms. So there isn't, even if you just think of sharing food, it's not simple. There isn't a just generic how to share food thing. Even in a group of people all sitting together with a pile of food in front of them, we usually think bigger people might need more food. Uh, Pregnant people might especially need food or at risk. Maybe people put more effort into it, need more food. Maybe permanent people, get more food as opposed to visitors, or vice versa. If we're supposed to take care of visitors first, right? Food sharing is complicated. And food is just one part of all the things we could share. And even the effort into food is only one of many different things.
Okay, but let's say we are in a group, like in a family, right? One does have to share food. Every evening, your family figures out some way of sharing food. And in my household, even though there's no scarcity of food, there's always some little thing to fight over. I want this piece, or oh, like one of my kids will not have finished his food and the other kid will be like, "Can I have that?" But it's like, but was the first kid done eating yet? Or was he out there before? Was he kind of marking that he wanted it so that, if you're not too full, then right.
Right.
We have these little disputes about who gets what food when and how we distribute food. Do they get dessert? Have they eaten their vegetables? There's lots of complexity in there, but we resolve it. And I think that they would say, "Look, everybody gets roughly what they deserve." And so from the fact that there's a lot of complexity, it doesn't follow that we couldn't come up with a solution. Like these groups do come up with solutions, fair solutions.
But the ability to develop, so I mean, you're looking at, on the one hand, the complexity of the world you're dealing with, and on the other hand, how much interconnection do people have? How often can they talk? How often do they see each other? How much can they observe each other? And the ability to not only generate but enforce norms about the behavior. So, yes, a small family together or a small forager group, and that's all in the same little, camp, they can, by paying a lot of attention to each other and the context, negotiate norms that don't typically take into account all the complexity,
Right.
but because they have more capacity to generate and maintain complexity, they will go up to that capacity in developing rules and norms about how to handle the situation they're in. And then as their environment changes, they can renegotiate with each other how those norms change.
And
And
in
in
the
this,
meta norms, like we don't spend more than a minute arguing about the food
right,
or
exactly.
mom gets to say or whatever, right? So there.
Right now, many ancient societies change so slowly that they could have pretty widespread norms across the entire society about what to do, how, and those were enforced and followed. But the world changed so slowly that, and the region was small enough as to be pretty uniform, that they didn't need to sort of adjust how the norms changed in one side of the region versus another side of the region, or and they could change them over time. But, this is about a scale. So I think Hayek and many other people have, in fact, noted that many socialist intuitions are, in fact, sort of family communi communism, basically. Family units and larger units like that often have and successfully do manage internal social norms. There's a standard story about 150 as this number. I'm trying to remember the guy who said it, but that basically, because in the distant past, humans lived in groups of less than 100 or so people. We just have a lot of social intuitions about how to manage those groups. Then we do that better. And that typically, when firms get larger than that, they tend to need more formal rules and different ways of doing things, because all the inherited ways of managing small groups that we can just so flexibly, you apply, just start to fail us in larger groups. And plausibly, then the world should be full of communes of roughly 100 size. And that's what, say, the Haredim and the Amish do, actually. The Haredim and the Amish are grouped into, they basically start with a size of 50. When they get to 100, they split into two groups of 50. And within those groups of 50, they are very communal and they have many norms of sharing. And they do, in fact, share the work and the effort,
So one
but
way,
they don't do it on larger scales.
right? So one way to think about just sort of the implied argument in that Orwell passage is that, um, you know, um, um, there's um, there's a question about how to share, and that's really a lot of questions put together. And what has to happen for any group that is going to come to the conclusion that it was done fairly is that the group has to have a consensus about all of those norms. And the bigger the scale, just the more difficult that problem is. And so one thing that you could get is you could get some kind of consensus enforcement mechanism or something where you could start to try to make the whole world be really similar. And then that might move in the direction of being allowing socialism. But so this would suggest, in fact, that the two things that we were separating, which is socialism and the class war, are maybe not so separate because in order for there to be socialism between, let's say, the working class and the upper class, there have to be shared norms about how to share, and they don't have those norms. And okay, I want to bring up a passage that I was very struck by. Orwell observes that one of the miners, so a common problem was the miners would become blind. And one of the miners who was basically blind, but when that happened, they would get a monthly payment because they couldn't work. But that he had to go and wait in this place to get his money and kind of apologize for the fact that he was getting this money. And Orwell observes that when he goes to the bank and there's even some problem that he's guilty for, the people at the bank are like very solicitous and respectful of him, where he hasn't like destroyed his eyesight by performing this function that was incredibly useful to society. He feels like he doesn't deserve nearly as much respect as he's getting, and his minor deserves way more respect, and yet is embarrassed to ask for this money. And that is just class difference, right? In how stuff is shared and who's owed what. So there isn't a communal language of fairness and sharing across the two classes. Uh, and that's exactly what creates the pressure. Well, maybe if we just destroyed the working class and there were no more of that kind of people and no more bad smells, we could all live happily together as like upper class people.
But
That's really what the thought boils down to.
sharing a culture is not at all sufficient for sharing to be effective or ideal. So there's this literature of how forager groups who lived in these groups of, 50 or 30 to 50 people roughly,
Mm.
they had very strong sharing norms, very strong egalitarian norms. But then when people became farmers, they had weaker norms, and that foragers in different groups with different kinds of environments, they share different things. And the key consistent pattern is the bigger the risk, the more you want to share. So in a forager group, if they hunt and they get a big animal or something, like that doesn't last very long and you can't fill yourself up on it. It just makes a lot more sense for people to share those big animals. But when people have their own plot of land they farm on, then it makes more sense for them not to share their farm produce with their neighboring farm because now that has monitoring and incentive problems, which are worth overcoming for the in the forager group. The forager group, like the individual hunter's variation in produce is so large that if you were trying to live as an individual hunter, that's just very hard. So individual animals who go out and hunt by themselves, they face very high risks that they can just have a streak while they get no food and then will die. And groups of animals then have a benefit if they share food because the variation is so high. And then that was a key thing that explains different forager groups, like the kind of berries say they could all pick easily. Well, they don't share those. They'll share the kind of meat that would be high variance. And so, the same way for, often the things we share are the things that we face high risks on and that individually would crush us. So even a group of farmers, they might share risk about flooding, say, or something that, uh, each one of them couldn't handle those risks by themselves.
Yeah, but I feel like that the point you're making now is just one level below and can be taken in by the socialism. Like the socialist of Orwellian socialists could say, yeah, everyone ought to farm their own plot of land and just eat whatever food is on their plot of land. But we have like insurance or, there's storms. There's sometimes we have to hunt big animals. And then basically, besides, look, we'll work all of that out. Like one of the ways in which we can work something out in such a way that we're fairly sharing the labor and the proceeds is that for some part of it, people do it for themselves. I think that's inconsistent. So, but the
But
issue is that the issue is getting shared norms about that, about which part is for you and which part is for everyone across these various groups. And they all have different norms about that.
so arguably in, say, the United States today, we do largely have shared norms about which things individuals should suffer their own risk through and which we share. Like we have socialized social security, we have Medicare, right? Employment insurance. We have actually a set of choices about which risks we share and which risks we don't. But I don't think Orwell would call it socialism because he wanted a lot more sharing than what we have.
But the point is just to think about what the limits to sharing might be. That is, I think the reason he wouldn't call it socialism is at least in part that there's actually a lot of disagreement about how much we should be sharing. I think if everybody were happy with the amount that we were sharing, um, and there was a bit that people had to do for themselves, but everyone was happy with the thought that they do that bit for themselves, I think he might be willing to call it socialism. It's sort of like, well, we don't actually all agree about how much healthcare should be on you versus on the state. Poverty, how much of it should be on you versus on the state. We don't all agree about that. And if we had shared norms about that, that everyone was happy with, that might be good enough for him. But then that's the difficulty is getting that kind of shared mindset in a country of so many people, let alone the whole world.
Well, I guess one way to think about this is, in analogous situations in the past, people did mostly agree, or at least they didn't argue very loudly for changes because mostly people accepted the way the world is. But in our world, people are used to lobbying for large changes from the way things are. And that's been part of the energy of socialism, is wanting to lobby for big changes. And that's sort of different, but that's sort of endemic to a world where we all, feel we should have a different opinion, different maybe from other people's opinion, push for it. And socialism has been part of this world of cultural change. Um,
Okay, I want to move on to the machine socialism, as I call it, of Orwell, which I think is really interesting. Because in effect, Orwell thinks that the biggest disadvantage of socialism is that it is a form of futurism. And people hate futurism and they hate a future of
right.
machines.
But again, let's be clear. This isn't implied by the policies descriptions of socialism. Socialism as a policy doesn't have to be future. This is the culture of socialism.
Right. I mean, this is for Orwell. I mean, Orwell does say that he thinks socialism is unimaginable without machines. So he says that.
Sure. But
Um,
that machines weren't actually the question, is whether there's this machine utopianism. That's the cultural thing he's
But he thinks
arguing
that
about.
machines entail machine utopianism. That once you got machines, what you people start thinking in this kind of innovator mindset, efficiency mindset, which he thinks human beings hadn't done for most of history. And by the way, that bit maybe is a bit compelling to me because for me, there's this standing question about like why didn't we innovate on the plow or why? There's a lot of things where we were just using them for a long time in ways that were not maximally efficient in the ancient world, like, not that much technology, in a people that was, in other ways, intellectually very sophisticated, and Orwell's thought is, like, they just didn't have that, Silicon Valley tech mindset that I mean, that the thing that the developers say to that of, like, we're always having to innovate and improve, and even as I always want the best kind of pencil sharpener, right? Can I do this faster? Can I do it more efficiently? Where could a machine substitute for a little bit of the labor? That mindset is relatively new, and that's interesting. And it may go along with the political innovation mindset. That is the thought that we're always wanting new policy or new culture or whatever. That may just be part of the same thing of this kind of new, like always be improving mode of interacting with the world.
But at the end of the section where he discusses this issue, his resolution is to say, look, we just need to all accept that we're not going to get rid of the machines. They're just here to stay. But he thinks you can have that attitude, the machines are here to stay, without embracing this machine utopianism. And that's his criticism. The socialists have embraced machine utopia, and that puts off a lot of people who aren't so sure machines are that utopian and see value in other things besides ease of life and comfort. That's his key argument. Machine utopianism puts this priority on the only thing important is make things easy. And he thinks a lot of people that doesn't appeal. And in fact, it's wrong. And there's a sense he's right about that, right? But so the accepting the machines are here to stay doesn't mean you have to take on this ideal of the point of everything is to make things easy.
But though, I mean, as I understood it, so for Orwell, this is also worth flagging. The contrast to socialism is not capitalism. Capitalism barely shows up in this essay.
Right.
Uh, it's a footnote. The contrast to socialism is fascism. So Orwell thinks, we're definitely going to have machines, but there's two flavors of machine world, the socialist flavor and the fascist flavor, and the socialist one's better because the fascist one, this in the fascist one, there's going to be this top down authoritarian thing that's going to dictate how we engage with the machines, and then that's worse than the socialist one. But so the point is, you might as well just accept the machines because they're here either way. Your choice is between the socialist versus some democratic versus fascistic
Right.
way of incorporating them, and we don't have to idealize them. Uh,
And
can I read a passage
please,
about the machine because I want to sort of bring that out. Um,
what page are we on?
so, uh, so let's say, page 174. Barring wars and unforeseen disasters, the future is envisaged as an ever more rapid march of mechanical progress. Machines to save work, machines to save thought, machines to save pain, hygiene, efficiency, organization, more hygiene, more efficiency, more organization, more machines, until finally you land up in the now familiar Wellesian utopia, aptly caricatured by Huxley in Brave New World. the paradise of little fat men. It's like Wall-E, the movie Wall-E just
Yeah.
starts with this, right? Um, and so I'm interested in this question, like, uh, Orwell has this idea that sort of the qualities we admire in human beings can only function in opposition to some kind of disaster, pain, or difficulty, but the tendency of mechanical progress is to eliminate disaster, pain, and difficulty. So human virtue, like the virtue of having strong muscles, like the miners, he's sort of rhapsodic about these miners' beautiful muscles. Um, and because they're naked too, a lot of them are almost naked, so you can see these rippling muscles, right? And they have these muscles not because they worked out at the gym, but because they have a kind of function of, kind of extracting this thing from nature that's keeping society going, and that, like, or the courage that they're exhibiting in dealing with their poverty or whatever. That all of that, all of those virtues are responses to adversity, and then we're trying to get rid of the adversity, and human beings are going to be fat and pathetic and useless. I'm just like, and he's really worried about that, and I find it a very striking worry to show up in a book, the whole first part of which was just detailing the sufferings of these miners and of these poor people's. I mean, really long passages about how the miners go underground and then they have to travel this long distance underground called traveling, where they are hunched over because the thing is not tall enough, and they hit their head if they let their head go down, so their neck has to be held up to look. And the suffering that Orwell felt when he would just go one quarter of the way, he would collapse, and they're practically running along this whole way. But that this is like this terrible form of suffering that they're subjected to on the one hand. And then on the other hand, he's like, but that's where human virtue lies. And you're not really going to be a good person unless you are subjected to the forms of adversity that our machines are going to steal from us.
On reflection, I think this is maybe his trying to embrace a working class ethic compared to
I
an upper class ethic
I agree.
here.
So that's where I was going. I agree.
That is, uh, upper class ethic is more about comfort and elegance of consumption and life, and he doesn't want to lean into that. He thinks that's sort of miserable and not to be respected.
Right. So what a really striking passage, he talks about how it's it's hard to drive a car now because we're in the early days of cars, to put it that way. Like we men of the night, yes, right? But he kind of says that, well, it's hard. You need some skill to drive a car, but you need less skill than to ride a horse. And he's like, and I'm sure in like 50 years, you'll need barely any skill to ride a car. And in 50 more years, a baby will be able to drive an airplane. Um, and he says, um, the objective of mechanical progress is a foolproof world, which may or may not mean a world inhabited by fools. In tying yourself to the ideal of mechanical efficiency, you tie yourself to the ideal of softness, but softness is repulsive. And thus, all progress is seen to be a frantic struggle towards an objective which you hope and pray will never be reached. Right. So I think it's the lower class ideal that is hard, that involves risk, right? And you see this even today among the Silicon Valley elevate. It's like the people who are praising risk a lot are often people who they did take risks when they were younger, but now they live very cushy and very risk-free lives. Um and but there's this ideal of facing risk and facing adversity and having to respond to it, and the thought is that only lower class culture can claim that mantle of
So,
form of virtue.
if we think about, say, the difference between fascism or capitalism and socialism with respect to this, you might think either of those other two systems could have also presented the machine utopia realized through their different means. Why is this an especially socialist issue? Well, I think the key idea is that in fascism and capitalism, we are leaning into some other difference that we think is legitimate, that gives us meaning. So in capitalism, there's the I'm going to be rich and I'm going to be better than other people because I'm rich. And in fascism, there's the our nation's going to beat the other nations, right?
Mm.
And the meaning in those other things isn't just we're going to be rich and comfy, but socialism seems to just present no, 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 you don't want to, nationalism is bad. You don't want to fight other nations. That's bad. And being better than other people, you don't want to be better than other people. That's not good, right? So they've emptied out these other sources of meaning, and then the risk is like, well, what do you got left here? Just comfiness?
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that's right. So I think that what really Orwell is noticing is that the goal is missing, or the positive, the idea of a positive target. It's like, when he has the idea of like, well, we're on a ship and we're all in it together and there's plenty for everybody. And it's like, so now suppose we've done it, we distributed to everybody. Now what? Is there anywhere we're going in the ship, or is there anything we're trying to do, we're trying to achieve? And it looks like qua socialist, you kind of have to say no because you're opposed to these all these other answers to like what it is
So
you might be trying to do once we've distributed everything fairly.
so I think, say, the Soviet Union and even China today, they lean into sort of humanity's destiny in the stars sort of images, as capitalism did to inspire people. That is, say, science fiction of the 60s and 70s was this idea that, a thing that we can unite behind is this great quest to, understand and conquer the universe. And we're going to do that together, even collectively. But just how are we going to do it exactly? And I think the Soviet Union wasn't just selling people on, we're going to be comfy. It was trying to sell people on this collective achievement of our society, what we were going to do together.
That was very much tied to like we're gonna be better than the West.
Right, but there was better.
And tied to the fascist thought, right? Or whatever you want to put it.
Right, but they deny it being fascist. They say, "Oh no, it's about, in some sense it's about the ideological fight." There's a sense in which the thing that's most meaningful about socialism is the ideological fight against the anti-socialists, and that's the war they can really get behind and have a war and a conflict. If they were to win the war, they'd be in more trouble. They wouldn't have a motive.
Yeah, right. Good. So right. So that the um in addition to creating a comfortable situation for everyone, like we can think, oh, that's really very far away. And in fact, he has a passage early on where he's like, look, the only reason why anyone ever pushes for any of this stuff is we know it won't happen. That is that there's a very deep conviction in all of these revolutionaries that this is not ever going to, you don't have to worry about how we won't like it if we got what we wanted because we're not getting what we wanted. What we're doing is fighting, fascists or
Right.
capitalists or
So
whatever.
I have to point out two sort of just factual predictions he got wrong.
Hmm.
One, he said that when he talked about the poverty in England, he basically was saying, and it's going to get worse because we lost the empire. The empire was making us be rich as English, but now that we've lost the empire, we're all going to get even more poor. This is going to be even worse, and nothing's going to fix this. But socialism would make innovation much faster, he claims, and we would get much faster in the future if we had socialism. But in fact, all the poverty he saw did go away in the intervening 70 years, 80 years really, because of um, capitalist growth. So he just doesn't see the possibility of capitalist growth getting rid of most of the poverty, and that he wants socialism to get rid of the poverty. And he thinks socialism is now going to be more effective at innovation, which in our experience is just not.
But again, I don't think he's trying to say that socialism is going to give you more innovation than capitalism.
No, he does. He does explicitly. There's a section where he says that explicitly,
Then
very explicitly.
really, I think it's
Right.
then fascism, not then capitalism. But
But then the current, yeah, no, he talks about capitalism. He talks about capitalism is wasteful because you don't have a good incentives to innovate, and socialism wouldn't be wasteful. Um, I'll try to find that,
okay, okay, okay.
but anyway, I think I'd like to also talk now about maybe the third of his issues in the book. One is the class war, and is comfortable with that. The second was this machine utopia,
Mhm.
and the third was his discomfort with all the other weirdos that were associated with socialism.
Mm.
And
Oh, wait, the
I
bearded yogi.
right, so I actually did a poll here that's going on at the moment that you guys can look, or you can give a link for, about types of people he just thought it was putting off regular people being associated with socialism because socialists tend to be associated with these people. I mean, there was even pistachio colored shirts was one thing he mentioned a lot. But then I have a list here: atheist, bearded, feminist, fruit juice drinker, internationalist, pro, nature cures, nudist, pacifist, poetry, birth control, divorce, free love, sandals, teetotaling, vegetarian, yoga, Quakers. He just saw that socialists tend to be associated with these people, and that when you went to a socialist meeting, you saw all these people, and that would put ordinary people off. And he was upset that, hey, we've got this good thing here. Let's not associate it with all this weird stuff. And I have this experience because been around contrarians where this issue comes up a lot in completely non-socialist worlds. So, I mean, and we've discussed this, I think, when we had our conversation with Ayla about different kinds of contrarians. But
Mm.
for example, I'm a libertarian in a, somewhat libertarian in a partner with lots of libertarian. But then if I'm weird in non-libertarian ways, they go like, you're tainting our weirdness with these other weirdnesses. And I think the usual idea is many contrarian groups want to state, look, we seem contrarian, but pretty soon we're going to be seen as ordinary and not contrarian. We don't want to identify with the other contrarians. We don't want to be associated with them. They're all wrong. They're mostly wrong, but we're right.
Mm.
Our contrarianism doesn't deserve to be seen as contrarian. And that's why, like many of these other groups, pacifists or atheists or, teetotalers, they don't want to be identified with these other groups either, because a teetotaler doesn't necessarily think the pacifists are right or the nudists are right. They think, well, it's just objectively true that people drink too much alcohol. We should drink less, but that shouldn't be a contrarian position. It just happens to be in our world. And there is, in some sense, not a natural alliance of contrarians in that sense, but contrarians do tend to correlate. I mean, it's striking how many of these sorts of groups do still tend to cluster together in leftist sort of, communities. And that's just an interesting conflict where Orwell basically says, look, the socialism thing shouldn't be seen as contrarian. It's completely reasonable. It should not be associated with this other weird stuff. Then it'll seem weird.
So, um, uh, I think I actually it took me a little while to try to understand what exactly was the problem with it seeming weird or with that these people are, doing yoga or wearing pistachio colored shirts. And so I think the key is let me bring in two passages. One of them, I'm not going to find them, but I roughly recall them. So one of them is about how a lot of these sort of a lot of intellectuals will come up with like a unified system where their ideology is going to penetrate into every aspect of their life. And so like he makes fun of Chesterton saying that like tea drinking is not really as Catholic as a beer drinking. Where it's
Right.
like your Catholicism has to determine like what you drink and what clothes you wear and who you associate with. Whereas for ordinary people, they just don't have this kind of totalizing outlook. They don't have the luxury of trying to bring like all of their stuff into line in that way. So like that's like on the one hand, and the like he has this line towards the end that I thought was really nice where he says that people um uh will um hold on. People are gonna like people are willing to accept sacrifice, etc., but what they won't accept is priggishness or something. Um uh that that's what um uh that's what the kind of socialist so there's this it's not just that they're weird in a specific way, in ways that kind of go to here. The ordinary man may not flinch from a dictatorship of the proletariat if you offer it tactfully. Offer him a dictatorship of the prigs and he gets ready to fight. Okay. So I think the thought is these people are like, no, this isn't the right food for you to eat. And this, you have to wear this kind of clothing and you have to like, not drink alcohol and you have to, this is so like, and I think this is related to like wokeness, right? And the anti woke agenda of like, we're manly. We're not woke, we're manly. That this is like the problem with these people, the yoga lovers and the teetotalers, is that they are not manly. They are priggish, and no working class, no self-respecting working class person could join a group of a bunch of bearded yoga loving, tea drinking, or non-beer drinking, pistachio shirt wearing people, because they're now what? They're kind of soft or so it's not just they're weird, it's a specific form of weird where being able to apply this totalizing ideological framework to constrain all of your tastes is a mark of a certain kind of luxury.
Well, it's true that these tend to be non-working class things, and that working class people will just not like them. They are not upper class people things either. They're just weird. So I think the more fundamental thing is that they're weird, not so much that they're upper
Yes,
class
even
or lower
when
class.
she talks about that dreary tribe of high-minded women and sandal wearers and bearded fruit juice drinkers who come knocking toward the smell of progress like blue bottles to a dead cat, so that women, high-minded women, it's not weirdos, it's high-minded women, that's very much not the same as weirdos. High-minded women, sandal wearers, bearded futures drinkers. I think that that's we should hear that. The modern word for that is woke people. That is people who are, like, so delicate in their sensibilities and so easily offended, and they have to this is how they have to dress, and this is how they have to talk, and they are people who are subject to having a totalizing ideology take over their sensibility in ways that a tough person who has to adjust to scarcity and difficulty is never going to.
So you call it totalizing. If I think of the working class culture as a package that's somewhat integrated, say around concepts of toughness and strength and determination and work, I don't know that that's any less consistent than this package of things.
Hmm.
I don't think these are more consistent, but they are interestingly different. And there's some aesthetic that they share in common that's noticeable, but consistency isn't a hallmark of this package of things. I don't think there's much consistently between nudist and atheist and pacifist and poetry and, sandals. But I see
I
how we
get the
feel.
vibe. I mean, I kinda
Right.
get the vibe.
Right. But it's not a totalizing ideology producing this package. It's some sort of a culture thing. There's some shared culture of these
Right.
people and their styles.
Like, so when I think about, like, here are 2 elements of the working class culture. I'll do one that I brought out, which is they don't wanna live in the air. That is, they want their house
Right.
to be on the ground. And here's another one that, struck me a lot. So a lot of these men were unemployed, like, for decades, and their wives were just, like, killing themselves working, keeping a little like, getting food and cleaning the food and serving and raising the children and keeping the house clean, and the men didn't do any housework. They were just and there was this big problem of what to do with all these idle men, and there would be these rec centers and things just so that they could just have something to do, and you might have thought, "Why don't they do some housework? Why don't they help with the kids? Right? They have all this free time." But the thought is like, no, that's just not permitted, and it's not the men, it's the women who thought that wouldn't be permitted, because then the men wouldn't be manly. If the men swept the floor, then they're not manly. So this is the working class,
Yeah.
ideology. It's things like men can't ever do housework, and you can't live in the air. And maybe this is the deep, like, cultural difference, but I think you're right that these cultures that it's not that the juice drinking, yoga, whatever person is
Sandal wearing.
or sandal wearing, it's not upper class, it's something else. It's
Sort of a
missionary class, maybe
bohemian. We often call it now.
maybe an offshoot of the upper class, the part of the upper class that doesn't like the fact that it's upper class.
Right. But the interesting thing is this has continued over a century here and probably earlier. That is, there's these rebels and they act in sort of distinctive rebel culture ways.
Right, and that's what Orwell's picking up is that, like, working class culture is not compatible with rebel culture. The working
Right. The raise the puzzle. Why is there a rebel culture and why do more socialists be in the rebel culture? But yeah, that's going on. So it one thing that really struck me in the early part of the book was this description of when men retired, what they did with their time. And apparently, a lot of them just spent all the time reading newspapers and then wanting to talk about newspapers with each other. So this is to an intellectual, a surprising like, affirmation of intellectualism in a certain sense. That is, when working class people, after a long life of very little intellectual stuff, they had free time. They wanted to try to be the kind of intellectuals they could be by going to the library and reading newspapers and talking about this stuff all the time. And here's this somewhat intellectual writer who hated them, didn't want to talk about them to their intellectual things. And there's a sense in which the news attraction of their intellectual, you know, uh, I, you know, inclination was a waste. That is, I do think it's in fact a waste when intellectuals who have the potential to think about interesting things get sucked into the news and spend all their time thinking about the news. And I feel that similar maybe to how Orwell felt about tinned food or something. I feel there's this rich, healthy intellectual food, and they're having the tinned food of newspapers.
We better stop because I gotta go teach my class.
All right. Nice talking.